Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I do want to say thank you to the Study GRC team for all the good work they're doing for upskilling for GRC practitioners. I'm honored they asked me to do this talk. And I really wanted to take this opportunity to be a little more casual, especially like in my delivery. I normally try to be really professional, but what I want to say is like, don't let the title fool you. I'm not inherently like a HITRUST hater. I think it's a good framework, but I really wanted to lead a discussion on managing expectations regarding HITRUST. It's a beast. It's not easy. And there's a lot of dialogue around whether HITRUST is appropriate for companies to pursue. So I really want to provide some clarity about what it is, how it works, and an organization can decide whether it's right for them. A little bit about me before we jump in. I am Marissa Russo. I'm located in Pittsburgh. I am a senior manager of IT risk and compliance on the governance risk and compliance team at the Hershey Company. We sit under the information security org. But prior to that, I was a consultant at a really, really small firm and a really, really big firm. And I have a lot of experience across different frameworks, particularly ISO 27001 is my bread and butter. But you can see on the screen, if we were IRL, I would have a big bag of candy. I wish I could share that with you today. So what are we going to talk about today? Number one, what is HITRUST? And then I'm going to do an overview of the assessment types. I'm only going to be focusing on E1, I1, and R2. There are AI-related assessment types that I am not familiar with. I'm not going to get into those today. We're going to be talking about MyCSF, how to scope it, how to score it, how to execute the audit, and a cost breakdown, really high-level cost breakdown. And I do want to say that this talk is meant for GRC practitioners to understand what is required to obtain a HITRUST certification. This does not include implementation of technical controls. And you're going to hear me say audit and auditor. It's actually assessment and assessor, but I do that all the time. I'll try to keep it straight. I know the difference between an audit is like really deep diving, really trying to find issues. Assessments are kind of just making sure that you're doing the hygiene, you're doing the things that you should be doing. And I want to say, I'm not a HITRUST expert. You're probably like, Marissa, you work at a chocolate company. Why are you doing a presentation on HITRUST? I'm not an expert in HITRUST. I'm not an expert in anything, to be honest, but I've done quite a few assessments against the I1 and the R2 full implementations all through the assessment, like leading it all through the assessment. And I recognize that GRC folks with HITRUST may be a little more few and far between than things like ISO 27001, SOC 2, NIST, things like that. So this is more about knowledge sharing and less about, hey, I'm an expert and I'm like giving you an expert presentation. All right, so what is HITRUST? HITRUST stands for Health Insurance Trust Alliance. And prior to HITRUST, a lot of healthcare companies were using the HIPAA security rule as a guiding light. And to be frank, the HIPAA security rule covers really basic information security protections and healthcare data protections, but the controls aren't super stringent. And like, I'm pretty sure the last time it was updated was like 2005. Oh no, this says 2013 up here. And it's like being updated right now, but it's not because the government freeze. I have no idea what's going on, but you can't really be HIPAA certified. So I believe that this was created out of that need. You can actually see on the left side of my screen here, this is the Cyber Risk Foundation. They rank how well the controls cover like various domains. And like you can see here that education management, like it doesn't even go up to 30%. So these controls in HIPAA were really, really lacking. HITRUST was designed to provide assurance to stakeholders that companies are protecting PHI. I know that here in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, quote UPMC, requires their vendors to be HITRUST certified to work with them. And I can only imagine that other healthcare conglomerates are requiring this, possibly small companies, to cough up a pretty big chunk of money to obtain the certification to be able to work with them. We'll be getting into the cost later. There are 19 domains in HITRUST, and what I've noticed from the 3 to 4 clients that I had worked with this on, it was a range of 200 or 150 to 250 controls that could be selected. And those selections are totally based on criteria. We'll get into that later. And it's actually really funny to me because when I started like researching for this and I was on HITRUST's website, I realized that they're moving away from like healthcare. And they're really trying to market themselves as like a quote from their website, global holistic risk management framework that integrates best practices over various domains to provide best-in-class security. So they are really trying to expand their domain. Like I said, they do have some AI frameworks, and I would just like Control F to try to see if the word health was even on that page. And the only place I saw it was like in the testimonials. I would be really interested to know how many folks are pursuing HITRUST as like a best practice versus a requirement that's passed down from like a healthcare conglomerate, but I digress. All right, so there are 3 assessment types that you should really know about, and the first 2 are stepping stones. E1, I1 are stepping stones that ultimately will help you get to the goal of the R2. The number after the assessment tells you how long the certification is valid for. So the E1 and the I1 valid for 1 year, R2 valid for 2 years. And with the E1, it stands for entry, and which is an entry level assessment, quote, ideal for startups and companies with less complex companies with a limited risk profile or less complexity. And it's really only 44 foundational security controls. So this is really to just super dip your toes in and understand like what security controls are. With I1, which stands for implemented 1 year. Until recently, this was the introductory framework that they advertise you can dip your toes in. It's called implemented because the controls are only scored against implemented versus R2, where you have a bunch of different scoring methods like policy, procedure, tulip, please. Policy, procedure, implemented, measured, and managed. And it's funny because implemented does not mean that it's just implemented, like you have an operating control. Some of the implemented controls are fully documentation based. And I'll use an example. I saw that in an I1 assessment in an I1 assessment, there was a data security agreement that was required to be written up and sent out to partners for them to review and sign off. So it's just kind of being measured against their implemented criteria. It sounds like it should be more of like the NIST quote, like protect, like operating controls, but it's not. It could be documentation based as well. Now, R2 stands for Readiness 2 Year, and this is the big boy of frameworks that they do, which is fully scored against all of their criteria. Readiness 2 year, controls have to be documented, you have to have procedures, you have to have them implemented, and then you can get bonus points based on measured and managed. You have a big assessment that reviews all of the controls in the first year of the audit. And then the second year of the audit, they choose one control from each of the 19 domains just to make sure that you're staying on top of things. So the interim audit, which is like the mid-year one interim assessment, goes pretty quickly. Although they advertise as if you can reuse controls across different assessment types, I'm finding that that's not really the case. There may be instances where controls either totally disappear in between those assessment types, or they mature so much that the control kind of becomes unrecognizable. And this definitely becomes a bigger issue if you're like adjusting your scope in between these 3 things. So you really aren't guaranteed to use every single control to mature like across the frameworks. And this is tough, right? Because you spend a lot of time implementing a control that could possibly not be reused as you go up. And I really always had a hard time discussing with my clients that wanted to jump into HITRUST and like make a recommendation that the one was like a right choice. Because if you're going to be like eventually moving to the R2, then why would you spend so much time doing an implementation just for like 1 year of certification? I mean, that's audit time. That's a lot of time on your GRC team. If you're using your GRC team, if you're using consultants, that's a lot of money. So if there's one takeaway that if anybody from HITRUST on the phone is listening, make the I1, I2. Like make it get a true stepping stone so folks can really understand what they're getting into when they make it to the art. Like I said, I had a really hard time ever recommending that the I1 was appropriate if you're just going to have to turn around and do the R2 within a year. So MyCSF is the tool that HITRUST requires for you to be able to execute the assessment. And they advertise it as like a general GRC tool, but I really can't imagine that you're going to use this for anything other than HITRUST. It's ultimately a controls repository that helps implementation and audit teams and the HITRUST teams scope and score your audit. The Annual $15,000 license for like the tier 1 license gets you 3 active assessments, which is theoretically like 6 years of HITRUST, but that's like $15,000 annually, because what it does is the interim assessment doesn't count as a full assessment. So you can have 3 HITRUST assessments. So it's nice because you can look back, right? You can see what controls, what information you submitted, what evidence you submitted last year, or I guess 2 assessments ago. And then you can look at your comments. You can see maybe where QA was having some concerns. So you can make sure that you get that the next time around. At the lowest level, which I believe is 5 users and $15,000 for 3 assessments, you purchase that annually. And if you need more users because you have a larger enterprise, I think it goes up to $30,000. I'm really not sure. And that's not really publicly accessible. I wouldn't say it's the most intuitive tool I've ever used, but it does really make it easy to conduct these assessments and score and understand where you are. But I wouldn't use it for other GRC frameworks. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So when you're actually starting to scope out your HITRUST assessment, they do have an option to add your other compliance framework control obligations. So in this one specific example, I had a client who was obviously, they're a healthcare company, so they were HIPAA required as well. So I went ahead and I thought, okay, well, they just want this for information. So I clicked the HIPAA in the scoping, and it brought in all of those HIPAA controls. And I had a really hard time differentiating the HIPAA controls between the HITRUST controls, which were being assessed. So they just seemed to like be there. Like the auditor was never going to, assessor was never going to look at them. I wasn't going to be filling that out because it wasn't required for my assessment. So if you're maybe kicking off an assessment for that and you want to use it as controls repository, great. But I wouldn't add those compliance obligations to your core HITRUST audit when you're conducting it. I also actually found that we were conducting the assessment fully outside of the tool and then uploading and attaching everything after the fact with MyCSF's offline assessment tool, because it can be kind of hard to navigate. This is going to be totally up to the discretion of your assessor. But with the ongoing R2 assessment that I was working on, we would do everything in SharePoint folders. They would ask for more evidence. We would submit more evidence. When we felt like it was finally in a good place, we would upload it. And that made it easier for us to make comments, have conversations when we weren't navigating this tool to do so. But when it is time to do QA, it is really easy. It's really easy to get feedback from HITRUST. It's really simple to understand your requirements. Let's move on to scoping. Scoping is super important in HITRUST because based on your results, it produces the amount of controls that are in scope for you. It's not like other frameworks where you may have a set amount of controls. Your controls are totally dictated by your scoping factors, and it really creates a nice dialogue around like what you should include in scope for cost effectiveness and also for your own technical resources. For example, I had a client who was just scoping out their HITRUST. They weren't really sure if they wanted to undergo the full assessment, and it created some really great dialogue around what they wanted to include in scope because they were a cloud-based technology and there is an endpoint domain that you could add, but they were like, why would we do that if our whole tool, all of the, like, we're never downloading anything onto our computers, it's all going to stay in the cloud. So do we actually have to scope in those endpoint devices or maybe your wireless endpoints and things like that? So it does create a nice dialogue around that. They even have a question around like fax availability. Are you using faxes to send medical data? And they were like, we don't want to do that. We just want to make sure that we're doing everything over the tool. So they didn't end up selecting that. I don't have access to MyCSF right now. I really can't pull any specific examples. These are some of the factors: organization type, number of records, geographic factors, technical factors, regulatory factors, and then some questions. They're just yes or no. It's super easy to walk through. When it comes to HITRUST, less is more. You want to be more stringent versus ISO 27001, where you may want to cast a really big net. This will help save you money in both control execution and audit time down the road if you're more stringent when it comes to what you're selecting in scope. And you can play around with the cost a little bit here too. If you're not really sure you want to undergo your HITRUST assessment, you can actually, some assessors have access to a MyCSF sandbox and they can fill out the scoping questionnaire for you and it'll pop out what controls are in scope. So you don't have to purchase the tool like right off the bat because $15,000 is expensive, right? So I would definitely recommend finding an assessor that has a MyCSF sandbox that they can perform this scoping assessment for you. And then you can make that decision closer, like when you want to actually do the audit, because you do have to schedule your QA. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but you have to like schedule your QA. So you can't do it right before you want to go to the audit. But if you're really not sure, if you're on the fence, find an assessor with Sandbox, then you're not paying that $15,000 right up front. Scoring. I absolutely love their scoring. And I use their terminology when I'm talking about control maturity all the time. I feel like with like CMMC, some of those, especially because they just changed CMMC recently, I had a really hard time wrapping my head around some of that stuff when I'm starting to talk about control maturity, but their scoring makes things so much easier to understand. So if we're talking about the I1 and the E1, we're only really looking at this implemented section, right? Right here, E1, I1, and R2 for scoring. But when we're talking about the R2, we're thinking about everything that is included in here. And if you look at the policy and procedure, this is like yes or no. Do you have a policy? If you have a policy and you have a procedure, those are documented, great. You're getting documented, you're getting 100%. If it's in good shape, great. Where things get a little weird is in the actual implemented, measured, and managed. So you have tiers of implementation strength. A couple examples of where you might be able to, like where you might falter is if the control says you have to do like a quarterly review and you're only doing 2 out of the 4 of those, then you're going to get a 50%. You're going to get this tier 2, this moderate scoring, partially compliant, whatever. If you have a bunch of elements, which we're going to talk about next, because there's like different parts of a control, then you're only doing maybe 1 out of the 3 or 2 out of the 3, then you're going to land somewhere down here. If you're doing everything that the control says that they want you to, you're going to get a very high. Measured and managed are not required. They are bonus points. So you need some sort of like minimum number of points to pass the audit. These domains represent how teams are understanding their control effectiveness, how leadership is reviewing the controls, and demonstrates that you do have methods for continual improvements. And I will say measured and managed is really where you're going to lean on your general information security management system for bonus points. I would not recommend undergoing HITRUST if you don't have a foundational information security management program. Something like ISO 27001, you have like regular governance. You can't just go 0 to HITRUST. Like that's not a good idea. So if we have some sort of information security management system, we have things like risk meetings with stakeholders. You can really leverage those existing processes to get bonus points in measured and managed. If you have dashboards, you could use something like that, but you have to show that that dashboard isn't just like sitting there. You have to show that somebody's looking at it. You have to show that they're recommending continual improvements, making change adjustments to how the controls are operating. So what measured and managed can do is get you those bonus points. If you're like, you don't have to strive for perfection. You have flexibility to miss the mark. You're always going to miss the mark. Nobody's perfect. Sometimes controls fail. That's just how it is. So if you're using measured and managed, then you can get those bonus points to bring your score up, and then that could make or break your assessment. So executing the audit. For the sake of time, I'm skipping over implementation. Like I said, we're moving straight to audit execution. So let's assume that you're already scoped, you did your controls implementation. Here's how we actually execute on the audit. So I'm looking up in the right side right now, and I did create a fake control just for the sake of this. And they have things called baseline requirements and then elements. So the baseline requirement is kind of like a summary of the control and what needs to be done, but the elements are the things that you actually have to address. So in our specific example, we say employees undergo a background check, employees sign documentation regarding acceptable use, employee access is removed from the system within 24 hours of termination. And that baseline requirement is users go through formal onboarding and termination processes. So this is how I like to approach it. First, I do my write-ups against this. I would say for element 1, employees undergo a background check through the HR process, and here is the background check tool that we use. For element 2, I would write up employees sign documentation regarding acceptable use via the acceptable use policy that is delivered during onboarding in our LMS, our learning management system. And for element number 3, employee access is removed from the system within 24 hours of termination. I would say our HR sends an email to our IT team and they shut off Active Directory. So I would first do those write-ups, and then I would sit and I would say, what policy, procedure, implemented, measured, managed, what evidence can then I provide the assessor to demonstrate that we're doing all of these things? So when I looked at that, I said, okay, my HR policy is going to show that we onboard. My HR, that we do background checks. My HR onboarding procedure is going to show how exactly we do that. My IT policy is going to show that we have an onboarding and termination to make sure that they're turned on and turned off. And our offboarding procedure is going to show how we're terminating that within 24 hours. That's aligned in my procedure. My acceptable use policy is in alignment with element 2, that we have an acceptable use policy. And then I'm going to take a screenshot of the LMS to show that this is part of the onboarding training, that people are actually doing it, that they're not getting access to the system possibly until that is done. And then I'm going to show evidence of the employee deactivation and Active Directory to show that it's actually being done. Maybe I'll take a sample of 5 users of that happening. And I'll take a sample of 5 users undergoing the background check. And then maybe I have a dashboard that's connected to my LMS that's connected to Active Directory, that shows that these are operating effectively. And then if, for example, we see that maybe they're being terminated in 48 hours, I had a corrective action plan already documented that shows that we are working to get this back into compliance. And we caught it because we have a dashboard, somebody was looking at it, and now we're back in compliance, which will do some of the measured and managed. So first, I do the write-ups. I say what evidence will satisfy all of these requirements. And then in the tool, you tag it. So in the tool, you upload the evidence, you upload your elements under like a comments section, and then you tag, literally check a box that says the policy is related to this, this, and this. What's really nice is if I'm ever using the acceptable use policy again, for example, I only have to upload it once and then I just tag it to the control. So you're just kind of taking that piece of evidence and you're just adding it to whatever control it's using to satisfy. So tagging the evidence is a second step. Another cool thing that HITRUST does is you can like tag shared responsibilities. So if I have AWS as my cloud provider, and they're responsible for the management of my data center, I'm not actually ever going to look at that data center. So I can say, hey, AWS, please, this is your responsibility. And it actually sends a request off to AWS. So I'm like high-fiving them and they're like, yeah, like we do this for you. And they say yes, and you get a high five. And now you never have to look at that control because they are saying that they're doing this on your behalf. This control is covered. If they're not set up in like AWS to actually, or excuse me, if they're not set up in HITRUST to do this, then I would tag my contract with a company. So if I'm using like a small data center versus like a big data center, I would just upload like the contract for those shared responsibilities. And then you move into QA. Once all of that's done and you and your assessor say all of these controls look great, we've scored them, we feel really comfortable. Now you have to book a QA slot. And this is where some things can get weird. So you book a QA slot. Sometimes HITRUST does the QA when they say they're going to do it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes QA can last a week. Sometimes QA can last a couple months. This is where I have a really big challenge because one time I had a client submit the audit. I believe it was like January 30th. And our QA slot was booked for the end of July. They didn't get to it. It wasn't actually started until August. They had some questions come back. We actually did not finish the QA process, even though they didn't find anything in the QA process until October, and we didn't get our certificates until the first week of November. And then the actual certificate is tagged on the submission date, which is June 30th. So when I clicked submit, or the assessor clicked submit, and they sent it off to HITRUST, that was like the day that the certificate was valid. So my client lost multiple months of certificate validity time because ended up, the QA process took so long and they were just like, people were like, oh, do you have it yet? Do you have it yet? And we're like, no, we're still waiting. We're still waiting. And that's like 6 months of money that kind of just disappears. So QA can be rough. It can go really fast. I've had it go really fast. It could also, worst case scenario, I believe, be drawn out for a couple months. So just be prepared to have some dialogue with QA. You may have to hop on some calls. They might ask for additional evidence, all of the above. If QA says we need to have some corrective actions in place. It's a normal corrective action process. It's not anything like a poem, like you're not doing anything huge. You're just going to write up a corrective action plan, how you're going to remediate it. And then that corrective action is going to be listed in your certificate. So when you're sending this to others, it will say, this is where we are having like some corrective action and this is where we're like monitoring it. And then what I found is during the interim assessment, if you do have a corrective action, surprise, that control is tagged because they want to see if you actually implemented your corrective action. And then you get your certificate issued. Ooh, a lot of talking. All right. This is my very, very, very swag estimate of cost breakdown. And HITRUST is expensive. I would say a lot of the dialogue around the criticism that I have seen related to HITRUST is how expensive it is. Now, you can start with the gap assessment, right? You could do it yourself. You could bring in auditors. That's why this cost is kind of 25 to 100, or not auditors. You can bring in consultants. You could bring an auditor. I guess theoretically auditors can do gap assessments. If you do it yourself, that's still time and resources. So I did put 25K down there to 100K. A gap assessment would be optional. You could just jump into it, see where you are, work on it as you go. Implementation time, you have resourcing from internal teams. You might have to buy some tools to be able to do this. Like, this is not, some of these controls you can't just do all in Excel, or if you did, it would be really, really burdensome. You could bring in consultants. If you have a smaller shop, might be 50K. If you have a big shop with a big scope, might be 200K, might be more. I couldn't imagine that if I was like a really big company trying to obtain this, that it would just be like 200K. Like this, like I said, this is like a really big swag estimate. Audit cost, if you're doing the E1 or the I1, you're gonna have to pay your auditor / assessor to perform that for 1 year, probably around 50K, could be a little less than that. If you're doing the R2, then what you're paying the assessor is for not only the first big one, but you're paying them to do the interim as well. So that would probably range around like 50 to 150K, depending on how big your scope is. And then MyCSF, like I said, if you're doing the base level, it's 15K. You have to do at least 3 years if you're doing the R2. So that's 45K. And then you have to pay for a validated assessment credit. And that validated assessment credit is for the opportunity for the HITRUST QAers to say that your assessors, what they did is correct. And that's 5K. And that's just like to pay, you have to have a validated assessment credit to actually pay for the QA. So, like I said, this is a really big swag. I just want to provide an example of what this could look like. So we're looking at 175 to 500K. Yeah, I know that's huge, but there, you made it through the audit. Congratulations.